Alrighty, good evening and welcome to Nikos and welcome to Roleplaying. For those of you that are just joining us and may have not seen any of my episodes before, I'm Jonathan Albin. I am a professional game master and I have been behind the Game Master's Shield for very nearly 50 years. So close as to be crazy. Anyway, we are actually 49 years, I guess. So I want to thank you and welcome you to the show. I anticipate we may have a bit broader of an audience than we usually do, simply because I actually did something crazy and announced it in my other social media tracks. I've got a Facebook account and such, and so if you're joining us because of that, welcome, welcome, welcome. And today we are going to spend some time talking about role-playing. And it dawned on me the other day when I was looking through some of the channels concerning role-play games that quite often the articles and such are focused only on people who have played role-play games, and there really isn't anything out there for those of you that haven't. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the terminology that's used in role-play games. We're going to be talking about, as you see, I've got an outline here. We're going to be talking about where the game is in role-playing games. What is the appeal of being somebody else? Why does somebody want to role-play? We're going to talk about the alternative definitions of it being either a juxtaposition or an interpolation of their personalities. We'll talk more about that. We're also going to be looking at the barrier of disbelief that we all automatically come into any playful environment with. And then we're also going to create a working catalog of useful terms. And after that, we're going to talk about how role-playing games actually activate your imagination. And we are going to actually do what we're talking about, and that is build a character together. And whether we do that in one form or another, we will. That remains to be seen. I'm going to cease this nonsense for now. I don't need this operating right now, so I just want it to be. Whoop, yeah, here we go. Alrighty, so. As I said, I'm Jonathan Albin, and we're going to be talking about role-playing now. So the first thing we have to kind of come up with is a definition of what role-playing is, because there are a broad spectrum of properties out there that utilize the term role-playing, and some of them are legitimate and some of them are less so, and so I want to try to clarify. Role-playing games spans a very broad spectrum of possibilities for play. Some of them are specifically taking on a particular role in a particular story, and we don't even necessarily think of it as being role-playing at the time, but we take on the tasks that would be appropriate for the person in that role, and therefore it is a form of role-play. And then there are ones that you are simply indulging in a world of fantasy where you are bringing to the table everything that you want to do in an imaginative way, and there are very few barriers, boundaries, limitations, rules that are involved. So role-playing, by definition, is you're socially interacting with a group in a game as a persona, as a personality that is not you. And the first thought that comes from that is, where is the game in role-playing games? Now, I think it's fascinating that we as beings define ourselves linearly in terms of our age, and we ascribe certain functions to youthfulness and certain functions to age as we get older. And that delineation generally falls along the lines of when did we stop playing games and start being grown up. And the term game in a role-playing game sort of is a misdirection, because many of us, when we think of a game, we think of, for example, sports. We think of the game of as being a limited term specific event with a winner and a loser, with a set of rules that define who determines what that winner or loser has to accomplish to achieve that. In the case of a role-playing game, you have to pretty much kind of toss that definition out the window, because the concept of a role-playing game is not one where there is a clear winner per se. The concept is that the participants who play are being the characters in the story, and the game, if you will, is literally when we were younger, we would say, that we're going to go outside and play cowboys and Indians, for a horrible term, or cops and robbers, or whatever. We were going to go out and we were going to make believe. All right. So the game is that we are going to, for a period of time, within set rules, which sort of makes it a game. There are boundaries that are set up within the environment, but those are the only pieces that feel like a game, because there is no clear winner or loser. Instead, it's just simply, we're going to make believe for a period of time, and we're going to do so within this framework. So the game of role-playing games is that permissiveness that we're providing ourselves to be able to be imaginative, creative, and in that space. So with that understood, then it becomes even perhaps more distant, because we think to ourselves, what would be the appeal of being somebody else? We're who we are. We grew up. We're now adult. We're now beyond that point. Why would a grown-up, why would you play role-play games? Now, granted, we look at people who are younger and we say, well, of course, kids are still being kids. They still are active in their imagination, and they're operating at that tier. So what's the appeal of being somebody else? Well, whether you play role-play games or whether you don't, you do engage in this appeal of being somebody else. You can see it every day with the amount of programming that's done. There are motion pictures that you see champions and heroes doing marvelous things. There are TV series that you sit and watch the evolution of a character through time. These are all examples of that kind of experience, but it's done in a vicarious nature. So the appeal in this case is that not only do you have it in an imaginative, vicarious nature, but now you're able to bring it viscerally within your own mind and say, what would it be like if I did those things? What if I were, for example, John McClane in the Die Hard series? What if I were Clark Kent in Superman? What would I do if I was in that situation? So this is the appeal, that you're actually being able to step out of the limitations and the bonds of our lives and become something more, something different for a period of time. And the concept of role-playing games really is actually the progression of that character through the period of a specific story. Now, that can be very short, as in one episode, 1 4-hour period, and you're done. Other role-playing environments can take years. The story of my own fantasy world where I run my role-play games is in the world of Nykos, and Nykos has a 12,500 year recorded history, and that is of all the times that people have played in the games. You add up all those sessions over time, it comes out to 12,500 years in the frame of that game, in the frame of those characters in the world. Now, as far as how long has it taken to play, well, as I said, I've been playing nonstop for 48 years, something like that, and so therefore it's see, I get in places where I get a loss for words. The saga becomes something more, and so therefore a player who is playing in it is getting to be something that he's not, and that can be thrilling and exciting when you let your mind go into those places and for that period of time consider what it would be like to be that character or that person. So when we now realize that, now it's a matter of looking at that character development. Is that character development, is that persona that we're building, is it outside of us? Is it a separate thing? Today's video game market allows us, for example, to become a character in a story, and that character can be sort of linear in nature, that we do know there's a beginning, a middle, and an end of that saga that they are in, and therefore we are now putting ourselves in that physical role of being that character, and we have actions that we can take, and unfortunately they're still ascribed to the mechanism of the video game market by the abilities that are allowed within the game, but that does not cause us to become that person in our minds. We don't become that tune, that character, that construct in any way other than to be the motive force behind it. In a roleplay game, a standard classic roleplay game, you are interpolating. In other words, you are becoming, for the sake of argument, for the sake of that game session, that person. So the actions and decisions that you make in that game are impacting not only you as the character, but you as the player, because as you are doing so, you're considering what those options mean. You're considering, if you were in that situation, what would you do? And that internalization, that interpolation of what is happening externally into the character is, if you will, that's where the charge comes from for both the storyteller and the players to be part of that scene and to be in that place and in that moment, at least within the imagination. Now, that means we have to step beyond the boundary of reality. In other words, we know the 4 or 5 or 20 of us that are sitting in a room, or in this case on computer screens across the world, we're sitting in our boxes looking at our screen. We have to realize, yes, we are in a role-play game. We are therefore imagining that we are someplace completely different. And that is a realization of the imagination. But we have to get past that barrier into the scene, into the story, into the place that's occurring in the game for us to experience it. That ability to step beyond the barrier of belief, they sometimes call the suspension of disbelief. You're actually shutting down the things that you know that obviously make it so that, well, obviously we're not really in another place. Obviously we're not really on another plane or whatever. We are, pardon me, I'm messing with my text because I got an issue with one letter hanging off there. There we go. I feel better now. I was sitting there looking at that question mark going, that's not right. That's not right. It's squared off. And I don't know if that helped any of you, but it really helped to square it away in my head. At least now I feel better. Okay, so the suspension of disbelief, this need to be in the mode or in the mean or in the location of the game, is the part where we are playing. It's that make believe. It's the re-triggering of the creativity of our imagination. So with that, now we're finally getting past that boundary and into the world of the imagination. Now, when we watch people vicariously who are playing a role-play game, we recognize that they know that they're in an imaginary place. If you have watched any of the live stream games that are out there, and there's myriad, you will notice that the players are very serious and very involved in the story and are emoting as if they were in that scene, and that's what's important to the game. And so when you're outside watching it, it feels a little weird because it's, that's operating in a mental space that I'm not currently in. That occupation means that right now that inability to immerse yourself means that you're still behind that barrier of disbelief. You're still going, this is crazy. This is not right. This is not sane. This is not really going on. It's only happening in their minds. But yes, that's exactly where it's happening. And so when you enter a role-playing game, you are going to be suspending that disbelief. You're going to internalize the decisions that happen in the game as if it was you. Well, there's a whole lot that we have to unpack here, because if you have to step into this whole new world, you need to have a working vocabulary. You need to be able to talk and understand what it is you're saying so that you can convey information to the others in the area and therefore be part of the game. So let's talk about this. You have more than likely heard the phrase that I used as the headline on this, and that is building a character. That term, if you have never done so before, if you've never even seen it happen, you have no idea what that phrase means. To build a character is to write down on a piece of paper or on a video screen the parameters of existence within that game for that character. In, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, you have more than likely heard people talk about things like the character's attributes, or they talk about their character's alignment, or they talk about their character's equipment. These are all things that are specific to that character within the parameters of the game's system. The more detailed the system, the more lists like this you would have to be tracking. So, ironically, the more realistic you want the game to be, the less realistic the game mechanic has to be. Because if we are going to emulate what's going on in our real world in a fictional place, that fictional place has to have the parameters, the place, the tangibility factor, if you will. So let's talk about, in particular, role-playing games, and in specific, Dungeons and Dragons. Within the Dungeons and Dragons mechanism, you have 6 attributes. They are in various game systems that are Dungeons and Dragons, and there are at least 5, they may be arguably 6 now, but the 6 systems are based on the edition of the rules that you're operating under. First edition rules, second edition rules, third, fourth, fifth, and now arguably either 1, which I think they're abandoning in favor of re-clarifying 5th with some new rules. Suffice it to say, there are currently 5 versions of the game, and each of the versions looks at attributes slightly differently in terms of how you create them, in order how you write them down, the order in which they have importance, and so on. So when we are looking at a Dungeons and Dragons character, we are looking at 6 attributes, and those attributes are attributable to every character in the game, and that includes all of the monsters and all of the villains, all of the heroes, all of the champions, all of the non-player characters, all technically have these attributes. So the 6 attributes are, and I'm just going to run down them in order. There is strength, and strength is your physical power, your physical ability to lift. It's your how strong you are, how much physical power you have. There's intelligence, and intelligence is your mental intellect, your mental power, if you will. Then there is wisdom, and wisdom sort of feels like intelligence, but wisdom generally is more considered to be your resolve, your how you go about making decisions, not necessarily what decisions you make. So the way most people look at these two terms, intelligence is your book learning and wisdom is your common sense. And that's fast and loose, and it doesn't really cover relatively well, but it does define both of those terms. Beyond wisdom, then you also have dexterity, and dexterity is to your speed as strength is to your, as your strength is to your physical characteristic. So dexterity is your agility. Maybe it's your nimbleness of fingers. Perhaps it's how fast you can run, and these kind of things are all modified by your dexterity. Beyond dexterity, you also have your constitution, and constitution could be considered your healthiness, your resilience to injury, to wounding, to a host of other things, but it's generally thought of as a physical characteristic. It's a hardiness. It's the capacity to withstand. And then finally, charisma. And charisma is sort of a combination between your attractiveness and your ability to convince. Kind of combination between your personality and your physical beauty. Now, all these numbers break down in certain circumstances, and that's why they are considered to be the attributes of the game. These are the points, the quote hard points, where numbers matter. So when you say that I am a strong character, that reflects a high value in the strength characteristic. And since every being out there, from the most hardy and virtually unkillable to the most fragile and dainty, have these attributes, they vary wildly. Now, the general game consensus is that they have a value somewhere between 3 and 18. Albeit the latest couple of editions of Dungeons and Dragons have done a lot to limit the negatives, so to reduce the number of low values and to ascribe a default automatically higher number than what could be. In my estimation, that somewhat weakens the very game concept of being a role player, because in a role-playing environment you would have to take whatever you get as far as numbers and then play that role. But Dungeons and Dragons has favored instead a wish fulfillment aspect, that when you build the character, you're building towards what you envision yourself doing as that character, and therefore the numbers are going to be less random and closer to being controlled. Yesterday I did a video on the NycosRPG system, and I'll put a card for that right up here. And just after we finish this, it'll be on the YouTube page. But you'll be able to get to that card, and it'll take you to that episode that talks about how these numbers pan out in the NycosRPG instead. But the idea within Dungeons and Dragons that these 6 numbers define your character's physical being only at the beginning of the game, and as time passes within the game, you do have opportunities to advance these numbers. So if you start with only a mediocre strength, by the end of the game, by the end of the time your character has lived, more than likely that number will have been raised 2 or 3 times, and so on. So now that you have the 6 characteristic numbers called the attributes created, your character is built, right? No. Those numbers define the starting point for character creation. The mechanism for doing so varies as wildly as the possible names for these attributes, but generally speaking, the attributes are generated by a random number generator. That is the rolling of dice, or the hitting of a button on your tablet or phone if you're using one of those modalities. But the point is that the numbers are generated, and they generate someplace between, since it's based on 3 6-sided dice, somewhere between 3 and 18. But the mechanism for rolling can be different. But the idea is that you'll be creating numbers between 3 and 18 for each of these attributes. Now that we've done that, you've got the numbers generated. The next thing you have to consider is, what kind of being are you? And that is stepping outside of what would be the norm, because of course if you ask me what kind of being I am, I'm a human being. That we all are fundamentally. There's no we can't really equivocate out of that. We are human beings. Maybe we have some personality configuring decisions that have been made where you don't feel that that's the case, but generally speaking, you're a human being. But oops, forgot about the labels. Silly me. It doesn't matter where I hold the camera matters. The choice of beings, however, in a role-play game, especially one that's specifically in a fantasy setting, is much more involved than that. For example, if you are playing Dungeons and Dragons, you have a myriad of different species you could play as. Now they use the term race, and it fits. It means a different form of beings, but mortals or human beings are one of those races. So there are elves, there are dwarves, there are halflings, there are gnomes, and each one of these has its own description. Each one of them can be as generally or as specifically detailed as you as a player wish it to be, or you as your game master determines to be. But these terms then give you additional defining characteristics that help you better understand this persona, this character that you're building. So once you've chosen a species and have taken the appropriate modifiers, because it seems like in every role-play game out there, if you take a species modifier, you automatically get changes to the mechanisms of the die rolls that are resultant from that. So dwarves will have a different set of number modifiers than an elf, for example. So now we've got a person. We've just determined what its species is, and then we have to consider what kind of a career path it is on. Now, in standard roleplay games, going back to the 1960s, actually 1970s, 1974, 75 is when the first of these was published, although there were roleplay experiences before that. We're not going to pursue a discussion of those right now. But the idea is that now that you have a character with a species, the next thing would be find out what kind of occupation that person has. Now, role-playing games have very clear defining characteristics, and they call these classes. Now, I didn't come up with the word, and in some cases it can be very objectionable, but the concept of being classist and holding the line on one of these classes for your correct character's advancement, it doesn't match with humanity's reality. That's not how we work. But it does mechanically allow for a differentiation, class versus class versus class, on what their abilities are. And since we are talking about a mechanism for being able to converse and share information, it does make sense that the characters are going to take on these roles. Having said that, the roles that they are portraying within the game are not necessarily definitive of the persona, but they are definitive of the character. Now, what do I mean when I say that? If you are in a role-play game and you are going to be playing the character who is the fighter in the group, for example, then you're going to consider the numbers that you established and look to see whether they make sense. If you have a high strength, then that probably works for a fighter, because they're going to be dependent on for physically striking blows against opponents, pushing down broken fences, or lifting a gate that's closing on the party or whatever. All of these associations between a race and the attributes, generally speaking, is static. So if you are a person who is an elf, then you get certain modifiers. If you are of a dwarven species, then you get a different set of modifiers, and so on. So now we've got established what the character's race is, and we figured out what its occupation is. And the occupations, generally speaking, for Dungeons and Dragons fall out like this. You have fighters. You have rogues, which are basically people that prefer to attack at range and are somewhat cowardly in their action, and they use dexterity, their gymnastic skills, far more than they do their brute strength. So beyond the warriors and the rogues, you also have priests, and generally they're called, in Dungeons & Dragons, they're called clerics. But the idea here is that it's a person who has ascribed themselves to a holy pursuit, either in the favor of a deity or in pursuit of finding a deity. And the power is therefore associated with that, and the forms of magics, generally speaking, clumped together in affiliation with the pantheon of the god being chosen. In the fifth edition, the most recent edition that's out there, they don't necessarily focus a lot on the limitations of following a specific deity. As a matter of fact, there's really no need for a character who happens to be a cleric to actually even have faith in some extra dimensional being. Yet it's this extra dimensional being that is affording them the benefits of their spell effects and such. I'm getting in the weeds. I don't mean to do that. There are 6 of these general classes: rogues, warriors, wizards, spellcasters, clerics, priests, whatever, and then a variety of sidelight characters that would also be found with the parents, but not necessarily specifically isolated from the other groups. So therefore, when you have a character, you're going to choose which of these classes. So you've got a race and you've got a class. Now these limitations that you're placing upon your character are actually helping you to build the framework of what you can or can't do in the game, because generally speaking, the game is about what the player does with what he has to work with. And so therefore, by having limitations such as species and their potential output of skills, does its job to make sure it feels more like a game. It's more regimented and easier to ascribe success or failure on an action. So now that we've got the character's class and race, now we have to look at the next part, which would be his connection to the world. Now this is not necessarily done in a meta environment. It doesn't necessarily happen outside of the game, but generally speaking, the game master will ascribe the player with the particular backgrounds to this or that specific group to make the play easier for them. But again, this is a game that's in the imagination, so the more you're able to isolate in your own head what this persona is like, the better off you're going to be at actually playing the character in the role. So now that you got those done, you'd think we'd be done, right? We've got everything about what your background is. We know a little bit about your family. We got an idea of what your occupation is. We've got everything we need, right? No, we do not. In roleplay games, for the last 48 years, just about every roleplay system out there ascribes the characters a numeric pool equal to the amount of injuries or wounds they can receive analytically, in other words, on paper, before they're dead, before they ceased to be. And so this pool of hit points becomes the mechanism by which a player determines whether or not he's, quote, succeeding or failing in a game session, because he's monitoring that hit point pool to make sure it does not go into a zero or a negative number, in which case at that point, when their hit points or hit pool or life points or whatever have been reduced to nothingness, then the game is over. The story is complete, and you as players can step away from the table. So now I got hit points. We've got a class and a race. We're set, right? No. Because now you have to describe certain physical objects to yourself in order to have ways of defending yourself against external attacks. Because ultimately, this is a game of a form of a game of survival. You're putting your persona, your character, into an environment, the game world, with the intent of advancing the character, gaining levels and extra points and such. But you're gaining that by experience within the game. So, now that you have the being, we have to have the stuff. So yes, you have to figure out, did you have to buy it or was it given it to you? Did you collect it from your ancestors or did you dig it out of a hole in the ground? These pieces all fall under the game master's prerogative on how he wants you to deal with it. But this regimentation of items becomes important in the long term because it's how you succeed or fail by achieving or not achieving the tasks given the items and things that are around you. Now, so when we get done, what we have is a piece of paper that has got the attributes on it. It has some set number of points, hit point pool or whatever that can be taken from you, and a list of equipment, gear, things that belong to your character. With all of that, the character is completed, right? Well, no, because now that you've got a character, we have to figure out, where did he come from? How did he get into this story? Well, if you're as clever as I am, you'd say, well, I just rolled him up. I just rolled the dice and I gave him these numbers and I ascribed to him these skills and this job, and therefore that's how we did it. It's like, well, wait. In a roleplay game, this session, the game is happening in a fictional place. It's not happening on a table someplace. It's not happening within a physical arena. It's going on within the minds of the players and the game master combined. And so the imagination now has to be sponsored or supplied with information and variables to work from. And that's what a game master does. A storyteller like myself creates the framework and all of the non-player characters and all the background imagery and all the items that you'll find on the ground and all of the sustenance you'll find to keep your character alive. These are all things that the game master has to provide. He has to build into the mechanism how you came to be where you are and what you were trying to accomplish. Alrighty, so now we've got the concept of what a character is. A character is the piece of paper with those numbers on it. A attribute is a numeric value that ascribes a physical characteristic to the character. The hit points are the number of points that the character has to have taken from him for him to, quote, end the game or lose. Where does the story come from? How does it play into this? Well, the storyteller, the game master, is going to be relating to you evidences of what is going on in the life of your character. Think of it kind of like a director for a motion picture establishing the scene. The things in and of the scene are not the character, neither is the character part of the scene, except when the player decides to interact with it. With your character, therefore, you're going to take the actions to move through the world. You're going to now have a vessel for your intellect to integrate into that fictional realm. And the boundary of that is where the player character, the piece of paper you have in front of you, integrates into the story that the game master, behind his shield and with all of his notes, has in front of him. The integration of those two is the dynamic, is the place for play. So now that we've gone through all of that, maybe you have a bit of an inkling. I don't know whether we're going to go further in this, but you have an inkling of what it is to be a character in a story. Just like names like Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man are all characters in Wizard of Oz, in more than one of the books too, but in the Wizard of Oz environment, so too do you with your character fit into the story of the Game Master. Now, I use the term story here specifically to refer to the environment. It does not necessarily mean that what he is doing is telling a story. We sometimes get confounded because there are a dozen terms that can describe the administrator of a game. I use the term Game Master because it applies to all the different forms of roleplay games that I've ever played. Some people use Dungeon Master, as in Dungeons and Dragons requires that to be, that is the name of a person who's running the game, the Dungeon Master. In the case of a more dark environment game like Vampire the Masquerade, they refer to their narrators as storytellers. The person who is administering the game is a storyteller. And in their case, there's already kind of a built-in through line that is the story. So I'm not going to address those in particular. But my point here is that the game master, the person who's running the setting, is integrating his experience, the things he wants to express, with you, the player, so that you as the player have a better understanding of where you are in this scene and therefore know what you can or can't do. Well, now that we have a character and he has a story, what's next? Well, the next bit is that interaction between your character and the beings that exist in this fictional world that the game master has created. There has to be ways for those two to integrate. There has to be a way for them to connect. And that is in the form of non-player characters. And this is not a term that you as a player necessarily need to be aware of. It's just something that you as a character know that you're going to run into other beings. And these other beings that you run into are all being administered and directed by the will of the storyteller. And these can be specifically helpful to the story or harmful. So there's really not a limitation to that. It can be either or, it could be both. Quite often a non-player character will start off on one side of the line and very closely be your friend, and in the next scene they turn on you and betray you. It's all at the whim of the storyteller. So these secondary beings, these non-player characters, for the sake of the game, you have to then suspend your disbelief because you have to experience them in terms of them being real. You have to be able to interact with them as if you were having a conversation with a real person in the world today. And that plays out by the game master, storyteller, taking on, as the storyteller, those roles. And therefore he's now going to be that shoe shine person, or that tax collector, or the ogre at the end of the bar. These extra personalities, and many of them are as flat as a piece of cardboard, they don't have any meaningful existence other than to transport information. These non-player characters are integrated with by players in a way so that the information that the game master needs to get to the player is conveyed. Again, sounds like a mouthful. Why am I doing this? You're thinking, We've been with this for almost an hour, Jonathan. Why are we doing this? Remember, we're doing this so we can play. Now, note that I've taken almost an hour to describe this, and that's without any pieces of paper and you having to operate in the theater of the mind to envision the things I'm talking about. I've motioned to a piece of paper and I've talked about writing things down, but it isn't until you've actually done it that you'll understand what I'm trying to convey. So I hope that I'm doing a fine job of narrating the potentially existent scene of your first game in a roleplay, first session in a roleplay game. But let's go a little bit further, shall we? So now you've got a character. You're going to run into NPCs, and some of the NPCs are good guys, and some of the NPCs are bad guys. Sometimes the NPC is a tree or a plant that you have to find a way to interact with. Maybe you can't talk to them at all. Maybe all you have to do is cut some branches. We don't know. But that interaction is what defines the difference between an NPC and window dressing. This leads to some challenges too, because you're going now, okay, so I'm stepping into the persona of the character, and I'm accepting these numbers to represent who I am. Where does my action fall into this? And that's where the game master's ability to narrate the location is very important. And so from a brand new player standpoint, just remember you can always ask the question, where am I? What was I doing before? And what kind of options do I have? Now, once you become a veteran at this, it would be a no-brainer, because you just simply say, well, I'm going to walk over to the door, I'm going to look through the scene before I open it all the way, and I'm going to see whether or not I can detect some of the bad guys. That process is the actual mechanism of roleplay, that you've got to be able to describe what you're doing, where you're standing, what you're seeing, in a way that the other players can act according to that information. Beyond the information that you need, therefore, on your character sheet, some of the things you need to understand are words like, you've probably heard me say, if you've watched any of my videos, you've heard me say a scenario. You'll hear me say an encounter. You might hear me say a turn or a round. All these terms are semantics, but they are associated with the game mechanics. And so it's hard in a generic way to describe them other than to say that the parameters for all actions, success or failure, are dependent upon the game mechanism that you are using. For example, if you're going to go outside and you're going to ride on your bicycle, and you go and get the bike out of the shed, you clear all the cobwebs away because you haven't ridden it in a while. Make sure the tires are inflated, and then you're going to get on the bicycle and go. That narrative is a narrative that would describe what a player might do in his turn if he had a bicycle in the shed. I know, sounds confusing. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as I can and concisely as I can. And if there's things that I'm not sharing you think I need to, let me know. I will be looking at the possibility of adding additional slides that have images that'll make it easier. But the idea is that you've built the character by coming up with a piece of paper, filling in the information so that it fits the parameter, and now you're interacting with the game as a character. All well and good, but there are times when you as a player, not as the character, but you as a player, need to have more information. How far down is the cliff in front of you, for example? I said cliff. Is that cliff a viaduct that might be an 8-foot drop? Or is that cliff, the cliffs of Dover and it's 60 meters to the water's edge? What do I mean when I use the terms? So it's going to be important to realize that there is constant feedback between you and the game master so that you can isolate in your mind what the space is that you're operating in so you can act accordingly within those boundaries. So, now we've also talked a little bit about, I said round and I said turn. Most games have a sequence of actions based on where a person is sitting in the room. Generally speaking, the person to your left will go before you and the person to the right will go after you. But Dungeons and Dragons and roleplay games like that don't necessarily want it to always happen in the same order, because that doesn't, quote, seem real. So they take from reality and they determine a die rolling modifier that will change one position against the other for the purpose of determining when the things happen. And so that roll for initiative is the first step in beginning a combat sequence, because combat sequences, quite frankly, can start when somebody just rolls out and puts a sign up that says something horrible. If they come out and they say, all Smogarians need to be exiled, that's a brash statement and hard to follow through on and divisive to boot. So when or how do these things manifest? Well, they manifest by the player choosing to make the actions and make the decisions, and then dealing with the ramifications that the storyteller places upon them. I could go further the weeds, but let's just state it this way. Your character is the piece of paper that's got your attributes on it. You build that, you create that item, that piece of paper, so that you have a framework to build the narrative story that you're going to internalize, and therefore through the suspension of disbelief, you're going to push away the reality aside and going to focus on what is going on in this fictional realm with the character that you created that is fiction. The appeal is therefore going to do the things that a person would do if they were in the conditions of your champion. And so I think I've covered everything there is to talk about what is a useful term for a player character. So now let's talk about how do we activate the imagination, because all of this is sort of predicated on you having an imagination. If you have stayed with me to the end of this video, I have to now turn on my little clicker that I shut off earlier, because you'll have the opportunity to pick up for free a copy of the rules of the NycosRPG. The book is called Dark Shards, and it's the first volume of the system books that will be created to define the Nykos role-playing system. You'll be able to get that simply by joining me on this Saturday at 10 a.m. Pacific time on my Discord. And to get to my Discord, you're going to reach out and send me a text with your email address, and I will send you the invitation to the Discord. I will be on this channel on Saturday for the viewers, so if you don't get an access either way, you can still join us vicariously as being part of the audience as we go through the very basic necessary information to play in a NycosRPG roleplay game. And this book is 149 pages, I believe, jammed with text, because it's got 35 different species, races that you can be. There are more than 30 or 40 skills per career path, and the career paths are analogous to the classes. So more and more options. These species all have their own particular marks that give them additional advantages or disadvantages based on what they are. And the most dynamic portion of the Dark Shards book is that it includes chunks and pieces on what it takes to affect magics, to cause magical effects. So I just wanted to put that out there to remind you that if you want to know more, the first line of defense to that is join us on Saturday. Just come right back to this channel, Saturday at 10 a.m., and we will go through the process together on how to build a character and how to play in the NycosRPG. Let me shut this thing down again. Alrighty, so I made it through the hour pretty much, got through most of the information that I wanted to. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the activation of your imagination, and if I have any viewers that want to chat, I'm more than willing to stay behind and carry on a conversation as we did the last couple of days. The process of activating imagination is literally the concept of considering the description of the character and deciding that you are in that place, able to see that item and interact with it and all other items in the world in game. So this takes some doing. If you've never done it before, you perhaps will want to recall when you were a child. What did you do when you played cops and robbers? Did you verbalize the actions, or did you act them out physically? Generally speaking, in role-play games, tabletop, you actually choose your action, and then you don't physically do that thing, but you do describe it in detail so that the storyteller knows what it is you're trying to accomplish. And in the process, you're also considering your surroundings, what might be around, what might be possible, and therefore acting with all of those parameters in place so that your character will be seen as being a part of that world. The last part is the realization that when you are in the zone, when you have accomplished what we're talking about here and you are playing in a role-play game, it will not feel like it's happening to somebody else. It will be the actions that you yourself took and how you responded to them. So that is the charge. That's where the excitement comes in, because now that you're making the decisions, you're impacting this persona's life in this alternative location that the storyteller has come up with, and therefore it becomes, you become vested, you become interested in holding on to it. And this is one of the reasons why many of the higher tier YouTube people will have different hats to wear, different things that they take on to become a persona in their fictional world. And therefore you can as well, by simply jumping in and landing with both feet within that fictional realm with your character, clearly an understanding of what that means in your head, and therefore you now change the course of the world. I want to thank you for your time being with us tonight, and I hope to see you in the next Game Master Soapbox. We're here every night at 11 p.m. on Twitch, and shortly thereafter the videos are uploaded to YouTube for the podcast Game Master Soapbox. So if you want to have some input into that, make sure you let us know in the comments below, or you can even join us in the chat box, write a question or whatever, and I will gladly respond to that. And of course, if you like the videos, make sure you click the like and the notifications so you make sure that you get them whenever we make new ones. So I will see you all tomorrow at 10 p.m. Pacific time. This is Game Master Soapbox. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, and I'll see you next time. Welcome to Nykos.